The trace is still dead straight, 200 meters at least.
That's no pot of whales, it's pacing us.
Then plot its course. I want bearings before we lose it.
Sir, it's accelerating!
In early 1969, the Joint Navy NO, a developmental effort codenamed Deep Blue Path, deployed a sparse grid of prototype underwater sensors across the entry corridor of the Bering Strait, a region chosen for its harsh turbulence and dense ice drift, conditions ideal for testing the robustness of experimental magneto-acoustic rays designed to detect low signal displacement beneath heavy interference. Yet from the moment the first week of data returned to the ADAC monitoring station, technicians noticed an anomaly they could not reconcile: a slow, continuous movement pattern extending nearly 12 nautical miles and maintaining a uniform signature as though a single elongated structure, approximately 200 meters in length according to the triangulation model, was traveling beneath the ice in a perfectly stable trajectory, neither drifting with currents nor fluctuating with pressure ridges, behaving instead like a guided platform moving at a deliberate 1.8 knots. The arrays were calibrated to differentiate between dense ice keels and subsurface metallic hulls, and while some readings resembled glacial mass signatures, the coherence of the return signal was unnervingly consistent, lacking the chaotic modulation expected when sea ice rotates, fractures, or collides with multi-year flows. Internal logs show that sensor analyst F. Barclay submitted a raised flag report noting repetitive resonant harmonics indicative of engineered structure, but his supervisor annotated the document with a terse dismissal citing seasonal ice anomalies, though Barclay later testified in a closed interview that the harmonics displayed parallel phase reflections characteristic of a continuous whole surface rather than irregular ice geometry. The situation escalated when the magnetometric component of the array emitted a priority alert during a February storm, detecting a sustained magnetic field disturbance consistent with large ferrous mass displacement at depths deeper than typical keel intrusion, prompting the monitoring team to temporarily classify the event as a possible unauthorized submarine transit. Yet when the Navy liaison reviewed the data, he ordered all references to hull structures removed, asserting that Soviet submarines could not operate in that region under such severe ice pressure, and therefore the readings must be the result of sensor oversensitivity. However, recalibration drills performed immediately afterward showed the system functioning within expected margins, and an inline diagnostic recorded that the anomaly's magnetic signature not only persisted, but exhibited a subtle oscillation at a frequency too regular to be natural, resembling the low-band cycling of an early propulsion system, or sustained energy emission. A surviving fragment of the internal ADAC tape log includes an operator's annotation: object passing under grid at uniform bearing, no drift variance. Weeks after the dismissal, Deep Blue Path operators conducted a covert night audit of the stored analog tapes, suspecting that higher command had quietly suppressed the anomaly's true nature, and when they replayed the magnetic and acoustic overlays they found far more detail than initial logs suggested. The 200-meter signature produced faint rhythmic pulses, aligned with the 26-second cycle, pulses too evenly spaced to represent fracturing ice, but entirely consistent with internal structural modulation such as ballast adjustment or controlled mass shifting mechanisms, and though the official review board later insisted such interpretations were speculative, the technicians noted that the pulses correlated perfectly across three separate arrays positioned over 20 kilometers apart, an alignment that only a cohesive moving object could produce. Moreover, deep scan hydrophones captured a low resonant undertone trailing the anomaly, a pressure displacement wave with a smooth sinusoidal curve, lacking the chaotic jitter characteristic of ice compression, and this undertone suggested a displacement volume vastly larger than any known submersible in 1969. When the technicians prepared an unofficial summary, a classified memo abruptly reassigned the entire sensor grid for Arctic drift calibration studies, effectively halting further tracking. Yet on the very night before deactivation, the arrays recorded one final sequence: a sharp transient spike followed by a sudden disappearance of all magnetic disturbance, as if the object had executed a controlled dive beyond the system's detection depth, or had passed into an unmapped sub-seafloor void. Satellite reconnaissance from the era, limited though it was, shows no ice breakup or collapse event that could explain the abrupt termination. Later that year, an internal Navy correspondence, declassified in fragmentary form decades later, described a linear under ice displacement event inconsistent with cryogenic mass behavior, the closest any official source came to acknowledging the anomaly. But the memo was immediately appended with a directive ordering all Deep Blue Path personnel to refrain from discussing elongated transient signatures with external agencies. Eyewitness accounts collected years after retirement indicate that several operators believed the object was not merely large, but articulated, possibly segmented, because minor phase shifts within the signal suggested multiple connected sections moving in perfect harmony. Attempts to trace any subsequent military investigation show a sudden gap in Arctic naval research beginning in early 1970, coinciding with reports of a classified survey mission in the strait that was never formally logged. Some technicians speculated the Navy had deployed an under-ice reconnaissance craft to pursue the anomaly. Though no surviving documentation confirms the mission's outcome, what remains undeniable is that Deep Blue Paths. By summer 1969, the shutdown of the Deep Blue Path grid generated quiet suspicion among several junior technicians who had monitored the anomaly from its first detection, and two of them, Barclay and sonar operator Reeves, began a covert side effort using leftover calibration gear stored in an auxiliary shed at the ADAC station, patching together a makeshift mini-array with only 3 working hydrophones and a stripped-down magnetometer head. The improvised system lacked formal sensitivity, but was still capable of detecting mid-band pressure modulations, and on the night of the 14th of July it captured a brief resurgence of the same elongated signature, weaker and deeper but unmistakably coherent, moving northward as if the object had altered its route after the grid was deactivated. This time the return pattern included a faint secondary oscillation, running parallel to the main body, a vibration that suggested a trailing component, or detachable segment maintaining synchronized motion. Reeves noted in his private log that the oscillation showed a phase-locked rhythm, the kind produced when two connected structures share an internal power distribution system. Before the operators could gather more data, a base security officer discovered their setup and confiscated the equipment, citing an order from Naval Command that all unsanctioned sensor activity within the strait is to be suspended due to interference risk with classified trials. Later that month, a cargo crate labeled as obsolete parts was loaded onto a patrol vessel headed for Kodiak, and an enlisted crewman later recalled hearing dull metallic thuds from inside the crate, as if heavy equipment were shifting despite being tightly packed. Unverified notes from a debrief decades later suggest the crate actually contained components of the prototype magneto-acoustic board that had recorded the anomaly's cleanest signal, removed before any chance of duplication. Meanwhile, atmospheric sonar buoys positioned far south of the original zone picked up a faint, narrowband harmonic matching the object's movement cycle, implying that whatever had traveled under the ice was now operating deeper and farther than the initial pathway, following a corridor that did not correspond to any known bathymetric depression. No official reports from 1969 mention this corridor, yet a blacked-out map fragment found in a declassified appendix shows a shaded trench-like formation stretching diagonally across the Chukchi Shelf, annotated only with the code R17 drift exclusion, a term absent from all documented Arctic operations, indicating some agency had charted a route long before Deep Blue Path existed. Late in the year, an internal communications audit uncovered another clue. A misfiled teletype message from a research vessel near the Diomede Islands reported a sudden sonar blackout lasting exactly 43 seconds, during which all outbound pings were absorbed rather than reflected, creating a void signature comparable to deep cave acoustics, but the depth at that location was far too shallow to produce such an effect. The vessel's navigator described a pressure silence, a sensation in which hull reverberation seemed to dampen as if cushioned by an unseen medium, and crew members claimed compasses twitched several degrees off bearing before stabilizing once the blackout ended. Although command dismissed the incident as interference from drifting icebergs, the navigator insisted no such formations were present within radar range, and that the absorption effect felt artificial, more like entering the marginal zone of a controlled acoustic field. When technicians at ADAC later reviewed the ship's emergency tape, they identified a peculiar frequency dip coinciding with the blackout, a dip nearly identical to the trough preceding the anomaly's disappearance during the final Deep Blue Path recording. Shortly afterward, all references to the event were removed from the shared network and rerouted through a classified archive. Unofficial recollections from retired officers mention that a temporary navigation ban was issued for a swath of the strait roughly corresponding to the anomaly's projected path, though the ban was publicly attributed to unstable ice, despite satellite records showing the region almost entirely clear. By December 1969, the military ceased all experimental sensor operations in the area and reassigned personnel without explanation. But the scattered remnants of logs, tape fragments, and eyewitness notes imply that the under-ice object did not simply vanish. It altered its depth, shifted its corridor, and continued traveling northward with the same steady purpose, leaving behind a trail of suppressed data. and a pattern of institutional discomfort consistent with encounters involving structured, powered, and unacknowledged underwater systems operating far beyond known technological limits. They logged the contact as ice flecks and noise, even though every analyst in the bunker-sized lab beneath Dutch Harbor knew the signature was wrong. Too smooth, too coherent, too purposefully modulated. The oscillation maintained a razor-stable cadence for 11 minutes before sinking below the array's threshold, in a curve identical to controlled depth change maneuvers used by classified submersibles. When the junior technician tried to run the trace through the Navy's spectral database, half the library returned access revoked, a message no civilian contractor had ever seen. 2 officers arrived the next morning, not in uniform, carrying a sealed directive that forced every researcher to sign a non-disclosure packet thicker than the project's whole manual. But the strangest part wasn't the signature itself, it was the metadata. The waveform behaved like a single rigid structure over 200 meters long, but with no turbulence markers, no cavitation, no thermal wake, as if the water itself parted and resealed without resistance. Weeks later, a memo circulated unofficially between analysts, warning that any future anomalies matching the same harmonic, glide pattern must be filed under environmental background noise regardless of amplitude. After that, the array seemed to go silent, not because the ocean quieted, but because the system began auto-suppressing whole frequency bands whenever the pattern reappeared, as though someone upstream had decided the sensors should forget what they were built to find. The surviving tapes from the period, those not overwritten or accidentally degaussed, carry odd artifacts, faint subharmonics drifting beneath the main channel like murmured mechanical breath, each event spaced almost exactly 36 days apart. A retired engineer later claimed the original system had been configured to triangulate sources across 3 seafloor stations, yet after 1,970 only one array remained active on record, while the other 2 were listed as never commissioned, contradicting photos taken by the installation crew. That same engineer recalled a night when the command center locked down without explanation, lights flickering as if from a massive power draw somewhere offshore. Shortly after, a classified vessel, the kind without hull numbers, anchored beyond the breakwater. Cargo cranes operated through dense fog, transferring long cylindrical containers that left no manifests. In the morning, the senior acoustician returned pale, insisting the team purge their backlog and focus strictly on normal oceanographic readings. He never elaborated, but the next anomaly, another perfect, gliding low-frequency movement, triggered no alarms. The system didn't even acknowledge it, as if the array itself had learned obedience, filtering out anything that suggested the presence of a silent, impossible shape roaming the deep corridor toward the Arctic night.